has its origins in the university, whether it's critical legal theory or critical race theory or critical penal theory or you name it. It came from university. I was watching a clip of a break smash and grab in San Francisco. It was on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I remember a conversation I had with a professor 20 years ago when he was trying to explain critical legal theory. And he said, you know what, we're going to change the legal system because the only reason it's against the law to take a candy bar out of a store is because rich white male heterosexual Christians don't need to steal candy bars. So they made a law. And I said, no. Theft is innate to the human species as pathological. You can't have a civilization with theft of any sort. But that idea that was common has filtered down to the street level. And that's why the universities they're a drag on the economy, they're a drag on the culture, they're a drag on the collective morality. And they either have to be radically changed or destroyed.
Those ideas are so pathological that only a half-rate intellectual could possibly believe them. So I studied the development of antisocial behavior in children, criminal behavior, for a long time. And so one of the things we found, so antisocial behavior is extremely stable. And once it's manifest, say, it's very, very difficult to do anything about it, to ameliorate it. There's virtually no evidence on the psychological front of any successful programs in relationship to the amelioration of antisocial personality. And so my research team, I didn't run it, but it was a research team I was associated with at McGill and at the University of Montreal, kept pushing back into childhood development to find the origins of antisocial behavior, because you see childhood conduct disorder in children as a precursor to adult criminality. And we could push it back, we being the broader research community, to 2 years of age. So at 2 years of age, there's a subset of children, they're almost all male, about 5% of males, who are temperamentally quite predatory in their aggression. And so they kick, hit, bite, and steal. And if you group kids together in age-matched groups, the most violent offenders are 2 years old. And the violent 2-year-olds are a subset of the 2-year-olds. And so you see that kind of in adult life, because about 1% of the criminals are responsible for 65% of the crimes, typical Pareto distribution. But you do have a subset of kids who will use predatory aggression as their primary mode of adaptation. Now, it turns out that the vast majority of those 2-year-olds are socialized by the age of 4. But some of them aren't. And the ones that aren't get rejected by their peers, because who the hell wants to play with someone who kicks, hits, bites, and steals, and then maybe also has tantrums if they don't get their way? It doesn't make you popular. It doesn't give you friends. And so what happens to those kids is that they fall farther and farther behind in their social development because they don't get into the peer networks, and they retain their primordial predatory aggression as their central means of adaptation. And so the idea that theft and criminality are a secondary consequence of a pathological social system seems to be, well, I imagine there are cases where that's true, but fundamentally it seems to be flawed, right? There is a proclivity to predatory aggression that's part and parcel of the panoply of human possibility, and most people are socialized out of that. So, you know, the reverse is a kind of bizarre Rousseauianism, right, that proclaims that every single human being is innately good, and it's only the corrupt social system that introduces any pathology into reality at all. And that, you know, and only an idiot French intellectual could believe that, and all their American acolytes.
I think what's worrisome about all of what we're talking about is that it's not abstract. It has real consequences that filter down. And by that I mean, it's so ubiquitous. The US military now has lowered physical standards in combat and special forces units to accommodate women that have innately, on average, not in every case, but less physical rigor and strength. And they feel there will be no downside. They have spent about 5 million hours going through the ranks collectively to search out what Mark Milley and Lloyd Alston in their congressional testimonies characterize as white rage and white supremacy and white privilege. And the funny thing about it is they have not met their recruitment standards suddenly. None of the three branches, and they haven't met the academies have not met their enrollment targets this year. And the reason probably, and there's no scientific data, but I think most people agree, is that for one reason or another, the military, almost like the British relied on the Gurkhas or the Indian Army relied on Sikhs, you could argue that the US Army relied on rural Americans, mostly white males, and south of the Mason-Dixon line. In fact, if you look at the fatality records in Iraq and Afghanistan, they died at about 75% of all combat deaths were white males, and yet they only made up 35% of the population. So here were Milley and Austin suggesting that they were going to be proportional in every aspect of the military, or repertory, in fact, except they never mentioned the data on the combat dead. And so what they essentially have done in the space of just about a year and a half, they've told all of these families, even though you went to Vietnam, and even though your son went to the first Gulf War, and even though it's a family tradition that your grandson fought in Afghanistan, now your great-grandson is going to turn 18, we still suspect that you suffer from white rage. And even though you died at double the numbers of your rubric, we're not going to count that. And so they've just said, we're done. We're not going to join. Go get somebody else from one of the, and that's happening everywhere in this country right now. And it's not just the military, you can see it with the airlines, pilot training. You can see it with medical school admissions. We used to make a joke in the United States, well, they're never going to do this where nuclear plant operators are pilots. They are going to.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and
definitely.
So I think we're getting to we're seeing civilizations. I mean, it's like that line in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises when he asked about bankruptcy. He said, how did you become bankrupt, Mike? And he said, gradually and then suddenly.
And then suddenly.
And I think
right.
Yes.
Right.
And I think that's what's happening with the United States. We've gone with this woke diversity stuff, and now it was gradual, and now it's just accelerated to the point of suddenly. And we're not seeing basic competency in our grid, in our transportation system, in our education. And so I think, and the data support that, and when people measure the United States quality of freedom or business environment vis-a-vis other countries, we've really fallen down. And
let's look at the military issue for a minute. So the American military is a very interesting institution because it's